The first time Elvira Hawkins saw Isaiah Yates, he was standing in her barn doorway with a broken plow in his hands and rain running off the brim of his hat, and she nearly shot him for a thief before he ever said a word. It was the spring of 1878, in the high grass country of the Wyoming Territory, where the Sweetwater Valley cut a green ribbon between two ranges of red rock, and where the Hawkins Ranch had once been the finest spread for 40 miles in any direction. That had been true when her husband Thomas was alive. 2 years after his horse threw him into a ravine during a summer storm, the fences were down in 6 places, the north pasture had gone to weeds, and the bank in Larkspur was sending letters every month with numbers written larger and larger, as if size alone might frighten her into giving up the land. She did not frighten easily. She had buried a husband and kept the ranch running on her own labor and the labor of 2 hired men who had since quit for better wages elsewhere. And she had learned to sleep with a shotgun leaned against the headboard of her bed. So when she heard boots in her barn at dusk, she took up that shotgun, wrapped a shawl over her nightdress, and walked out into the mud with her heart going like a drum and her fingers steady on the trigger. "You will want to explain yourself," she said, "before I explain myself to you." The man in the doorway raised his hand slowly, the plow blade still balanced in the crook of one elbow, and turned so that the last gray light fell across his face. He looked to be perhaps 30 years old, lean as a fence rail, with a jaw dark with several days' stubble, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. There was a patience in the way he held himself, the patience of a man who had been on the wrong end of a gun before and knew better than to make sudden movements. "Name's Isaiah Yates, ma'am," he said. "I was riding through and saw your plow had thrown a bolt clean out in the yard. Didn't seem right to leave it rusting in the wet. I was fixing to leave it just inside the door and be on my way before you ever knew I'd been here." "Men who mean no harm generally announce themselves at the front door," Elvira said, though she had already lowered the shotgun an inch. "Not skulk into a widow's barn at dark. I did knock at the house, ma'am. Nobody answered. I expect you were out at the spring house." He nodded toward the low stone building near the creek, and Elvira realized with some embarrassment that she had indeed been down there straining milk not 20 minutes past, and had heard nothing over the sound of the water. She studied him a long moment. He wore a coat gone thin at the elbows and boots that had been resoled more than once, and behind him in the deepening dark she could see a sway-backed bay horse cropping grass near her fence, its ribs showing plainly even in poor light. This was not a man riding fat off easy wages. This was a man who had been walking a hard road for some time. "You looking for work, Mr. Yates?" "I am looking for work, ma'am, though I did not come here looking for it tonight. I came here looking for a dry place to camp and heard your milk cow bawling like she was in pain, which generally means she has not been milked proper in some time, if you will pardon my saying so." Elvira felt her face go hot, not from anger but from the sting of a truth she already knew. Bessie had been giving her trouble for a week, and Elvira, exhausted from fence work and bookkeeping and grief that had not fully worn itself thin even after 2 years, had let the milking go later and later each evening. "I do not need a stranger telling me how to run my own dairy cow," she said, but there was less iron in it now. "No, ma'am, you surely do not." He set the plow down gently against the barn wall. "But you could use a hand with everything else, unless I am reading this place wrong. Fence down along the north pasture. Barn roof wants shingling before the next hard rain gets through it proper. And that bay gelding you have in the second stall is going lame in the off fore, though I expect you already know that." Elvira did know that, and had been dreading the cost of a farrier she could not presently pay. She lowered the shotgun the rest of the way, resting the stock against her hip, and looked at this ragged stranger with something between suspicion and desperate hope. "I cannot pay you much," she said finally. "The bank holds most of what this ranch earns before I ever see a dollar of it. I can offer a bed in the bunkhouse, 3 meals, and $40 a month if the herd sells well come fall. That is the truth of my situation, Mr. Yates, and I will not lie to a man about it, stranger or not. $40 and a full table beats what I have had the last 3 months put together, ma'am, Isaiah said, and something in his voice, some old weariness, made her wonder what road had brought him to her barn door in such a state. I will work for my keep and be glad of it. Then you had best come in out of the rain, she said, and we will discuss terms proper in the morning in the daylight, where I can see a man's face when he is making promises to me. That was how it began, not with any thunderclap of destiny, but with a broken plow, a hungry milk cow, and a widow too tired and too proud to admit how badly she needed help. The next morning Elvira came down to find that Isaiah had already milked Bessie, mended the loose board on the chicken coop, and was up on the barn roof with a mouthful of shingle nails, working with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done such labor his whole life. She stood in the yard with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand and watched him a moment before he noticed her. "You did not wait for terms," she called up. "Seemed a poor way to start, ma'am, waiting on a contract while your roof leaked another night." He climbed down the ladder and stood before her, hat in hand, and in the morning light she saw more clearly the hollows beneath his eyes, the way his shirt hung a little loose on his frame. "I am not a man who does things by half measures, Mrs. Hawkins. If you will have me as your foreman, I will run this ranch as though it were my own blood and bone. If you will not, I will finish the roof out of decency and be on my way before noon." Elvira had not expected the word foreman. She had thought perhaps a hired hand, someone to help with fence and stock through the calving season. But there was something in the way he said it, some quiet certainty, that made her reconsider. "You have run a ranch before." "I ran my father's spread in Missouri until the war took it and everything else besides," he said, and there was a flatness in his voice that told her this was not a story he offered easily. "After that I worked cattle in Texas, drove herds up the Kishom Trail 3 seasons running, foreman on a spread near Cheyenne for 2 years until the owner sold out to a mining concern and let the whole crew go. I have been drifting since, looking for a place worth putting my back into again. And you think this place is worth it? Look around you, Mr. Yates. Fences down, herd thinned to under 200 head. A bank that would as soon see me fail as watch me struggle, because failure means they take the land free and clear. I have seen worse dirt turned into better ranches," he said simply. "It takes work, and it takes someone willing to stay long enough to see it through. I have nowhere else I am particular about being, ma'am. Might as well be here." Elvira looked at him a long moment, at the mud on his boots and the calluses on his hands and the steady, unblinking way he held her gaze, not with insolence but with an honesty that felt almost like a gift after 2 years of men who either pitied her or tried to cheat her. "Foreman, then," she said, and put out her hand, and he shook it, his grip firm and warm and rough with work. $40 a month, room in the bunkhouse, meals at my table. And Mr. Yates, if you ever lie to me about the state of this ranch, good news or bad, you will find yourself back on that sway-backed horse of yours faster than you rode in." "I do not expect I will need reminding twice, Mrs. Hawkins," he said, and something in the corner of his mouth suggested the beginning of a smile. The weeks that followed were a lesson to Elvira in what a determined man could do with willing hands and a clear plan. Isaiah rose before dawn each day, and by the time Elvira had dressed and come down to start the stove, he was already out checking fence lines or doctoring a sick calf or riding the far pastures to count what remained of the scattered herd. He did not waste words, but he was not cold either. He had a way of speaking to the hired hands, the 2 young cowboys named Danny Whitcomb and Pete Aldrich, who Elvira had kept on despite barely being able to pay them, that made them work harder not from fear but from a wish to earn his quiet approval. Within a month, the fences were mended along the whole north boundary. Within 2, Isaiah had traded some of Elvira's less productive stock to a neighboring rancher for a young bull of good breeding, arguing that quality mattered more than quantity in a herd this size, and that better calves next spring would fetch better prices in the fall. Elvira had been skeptical of spending money she barely had, but when she saw the bull, a solid red Hereford with a deep chest and calm temperament, she understood the wisdom of it. "You have an eye for stock," she told him one evening as they stood at the corral fence watching the bull move among the cows. "My father taught me before the war took him," Isaiah said. Said a man could tell more about a rancher's future by looking at his bulls than by looking at his bank account. Bank accounts can be borrowed. Good breeding stock has to be built, one careful choice at a time. Is that where you learn patience too? From your father? Isaiah was quiet a moment, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was dropping behind the western ridge in a wash of orange and violet. "My father died at a place called Pea Ridge in Arkansas when I was 19 years old. I did not have him long enough to learn everything I might have wished, but he taught me enough that I have spent every year since trying to live up to what he started." Elvira thought of Thomas then, of the ranch he had built from nothing with his own hands, and of how she had spent 2 years feeling as though she were failing to live up to what he had started too. "I understand that feeling better than you might guess, Mr. Yates." "I expect you do, ma'am," he said, and for a moment their eyes met in the fading light, something passing between them that was not quite words, something that felt like recognition between two people who had each carried grief alone for longer than was good for the soul. She looked away first, busying herself with smoothing her apron, though her heart had picked up its pace in a way she was not ready to examine too closely. It was not only the ranch work that occupied them that spring. There was also the matter of Cornelius Blackwood, who owned the largest spread in the valley, a ranch called the Diamond B that ran nearly 10,000 head of cattle across land that bordered Elvira's on the western edge. Blackwood had made an offer to buy Elvira's ranch not long after Thomas died, an offer she had refused, believing she could manage on her own. Since then he had made 2 more offers, each one lower than the last, as though he believed her circumstances would only worsen and her price would only fall with them. Blackwood rode over one afternoon in early June, resplendent in a tailored coat that seemed entirely wrong for the dusty roads of the valley, accompanied by 2 of his ranch hands who sat their horses like men accustomed to being feared rather than respected. Elvira met him in the yard, Isaiah a few steps behind her, having come in from the pastures at the sound of riders. "Mrs. Hawkins," Blackwood said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that did not extend to his eyes. "I hear you have taken on a new foreman. I hope he is aware of the difficulties facing this little operation of yours." "Mr. Yates is well aware of everything concerning this ranch, Mr. Blackwood, including the fact that it is not for sale, now or at any point in the future." "A pity," Blackwood said, though his gaze had shifted to Isaiah, sizing him up the way a man might size up a horse he was considering for purchase. "You would think a man with real experience would advise a widow to take a fair offer while one is still on the table, rather than watch her struggle against debts that only grow larger each season." "I have advised Mrs. Hawkins on a great many things, Mr. Blackwood," Isaiah said, his voice even but with an edge beneath it that Elvira had not heard from him before. "None of them involved handing over land that has been fought for and bled for to a man who never once offered to help her keep it running, only to help himself to it once she failed." Blackwood's jaw tightened, though he kept his smile fixed in place. "Careful, Mr. Yates. This valley is smaller than you might think, and a man's reputation follows him from ranch to ranch. I would hate to see yours suffer on account of misplaced loyalty to a lost cause." "I have found lost causes are only lost when a man stops fighting for them," Isaiah replied. "This one is not lost, and I do not intend to stop." Blackwood held his gaze a moment longer, then turned his horse without another word, his 2 hands falling in behind him as they rode back toward the western boundary. Elvira watched them go, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, whether from anger or fear she could not entirely say. "He will not stop trying," she said quietly. "He has wanted this land since before Thomas died. There is good water on the eastern section that his own range lacks, and he knows it." Then we will make certain he has no cause to think you weak enough to press, Isaiah said. We will build this ranch back to what it was, and better, until Cornelius Blackwood looks at your fences and your herd and sees nothing but an operation too strong to trouble. You say we as though this ranch belongs to you as much as to me, Elvira said, though there was no real complaint in it, only observation. Isaiah looked at her then, and something passed across his face, some careful consideration of words before he spoke them. Forgive me if I have overstepped, Mrs. Hawkins. I only meant that a foreman takes a ranch's troubles as his own, or he is not much of a foreman. No, Elvira said. No, I do not mind it. I have been saying these past 2 years as though the weight of this place rested on one set of shoulders. It is a relief, I think, to say we again. That summer the ranch began to turn, slowly at first and then with gathering speed, the way a wagon wheel long stuck in mud will finally find purchase and roll free. Isaiah organized the branding of the spring calves with an efficiency Elvira had not seen since Thomas's day, running the operation with Danny and Pete, and 2 additional hands he had convinced to come work for wages that were fair though hardly generous, men who had heard through the valley's slow grapevine that the Hawkins Ranch was becoming a place worth working again. He dug a second well when the creek ran low in the dry weeks of July, arguing that a ranch dependent on a single water source was a ranch one bad season away from disaster. He repaired the old irrigation ditches that Thomas had dug years before and let fall into disrepair, bringing water to the hay fields that had gone dry and brown, so that by August the ranch had more hay stored for winter than it had seen in 3 years. Elvira found herself working alongside him more often than not because her presence was strictly necessary, but because she discovered she wanted to be near him, wanted to see the way he squinted against the sun while assessing a fence line, the way he spoke gently to a frightened calf while doctoring a wound, the way he laughed, rare but genuine, when Danny told some foolish joke around the supper table. It was during the haying season, in the sweltering heat of late July, that Elvira first understood the full depth of what she was feeling. They had been working since dawn, cutting and raking the tall grass in the east field, and by mid-afternoon Elvira had removed her bonnet and rolled her sleeves past her elbows, her dress damp with sweat and clinging to her, more concerned with the heat than with propriety since only Isaiah worked this particular field with her that day, the other hands occupied elsewhere. You should rest a spell, Mrs. Hawkins, Isaiah said, pausing beside the wagon to hand her a canteen of water. This heat is no friend to anyone working this hard. I am not made of glass, Mr. Yates, she said, though she took the canteen gratefully and drank deep. No, he agreed, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. You are not. I have not met many women, nor many men either if I am honest, who work as hard as you do, Mrs. Hawkins, or who care as much for this land as you plainly do. It was my husband's dream, she said, handing the canteen back. I suppose I have kept fighting for it because letting it go would feel like letting him go a second time. I do not think that is the whole of it, Isaiah said quietly. I think you love this land for its own sake now, not only for his memory. I have watched you these past months. You know every rise and hollow of this valley the way some folks know the lines on their own hand. That is not grief keeping you here, Mrs. Hawkins. That is love. Elvira looked at him, startled by how precisely he had named something she had not fully named to herself. You see a great deal, for a man who has only been here since spring. I have had a great deal of time to look, ma'am, working alongside you these past months, he said, and there was something in his voice now, some careful restraint, as though he were holding back words he was not certain he had any right to say. Isaiah, she said, using his given name for the first time since he had arrived, and she saw the surprise flicker across his face at the sound of it. I think, given all we have built together this season, you might call me Elvira, at least when we are not within earshot of the hands. Elvira, he said, testing the shape of it, and something in his eyes softened in a way that made her breath catch unexpectedly. It is a fine name. Suits you better than Mrs. Hawkins ever did, if you will forgive my saying so. "I will forgive it," she said, smiling despite herself. "This once." They returned to the haying then, but something had shifted between them in that exchange. Some door left open that neither was yet prepared to walk fully through, though both, she suspected, had begun to sense it standing there. The autumn brought its own trials. In September, a band of rustlers who had been working their way through the valley, stealing small numbers of cattle from several ranches over the preceding weeks, struck the Hawkins spread on a moonless night, cutting fence along the eastern pasture, and driving off nearly 30 head before Isaiah, sleeping light as he always did, heard the commotion and roused Danny and Pete to ride after them. Elvira insisted on riding as well, over Isaiah's initial protest, and he relented only when she reminded him sharply that it was her cattle being stolen and her right to defend her own property. "Then you ride behind me, and you do exactly as I say the moment there is trouble," Isaiah said, already swinging up onto his horse. "I did not take this position to watch you shot dead over 30 head of cattle, Elvira. Cattle can be replaced. You cannot." The urgency in his voice, the raw fear beneath the command, struck her more than any argument could have. She nodded and mounted quickly, and the four of them rode hard through the darkness, following the trampled grass and scattered hoof prints toward the northern hills. They caught the rustlers, 3 rough men with a small herd of stolen cattle bunched in a narrow draw, just as the first gray light of dawn was breaking over the ridgeline. There was a brief, tense standoff, shouted warnings. A single shot fired into the air by one of the rustlers meant more to frighten than to harm, and then Isaiah's steady voice cutting through the chaos. "You are outnumbered, and you know this country will not hide you long," he called out. "Leave the cattle and ride on, and we will not pursue you further. Try anything else, and I promise you we will." Perhaps it was the calm certainty in his voice, or perhaps the rustlers had simply not expected to be caught so quickly and had no stomach for a real fight over another man's cattle. But after a long, taut moment, they wheeled their horses and rode off into the hills, leaving the stolen herd behind in the draw. "Are you hurt?" Isaiah asked, wheeling his horse back to Elvira's side almost before the rustlers had disappeared from view, his hands running lightly over her arms as though checking for wounds, despite the darkness making it nearly impossible to see any. "I am unhurt," she said, though her heart was pounding fiercely, whether from the danger just past or from the nearness of him she could not entirely say. "Isaiah, you could have been shot calling out to them like that." "I have been shot at before," he said, though his hands had not left her arms, and in the growing light she could see the tension in his jaw beginning to ease. "I was not about to let them take what you have worked so hard to build back." "What we have worked to build back," she corrected softly, echoing his own words from months before, and something in his expression broke open then, some careful wall he had maintained all these months finally cracking. "Elvira," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed to be fighting to contain, "I have tried very hard these past months to remember my place here. You are my employer, and a widow only 2 years past her grief, and I have no right to speak to you as anything other than your foreman. But I find I am losing the fight against my own feelings, and I think you should know that before this goes on any longer." Elvira's breath caught. Around them, Danny and Pete were beginning to gather the recovered cattle, their voices carrying faintly across the draw, but in this moment it felt as though the whole world had narrowed down to the space between her and Isaiah, the gray dawn light, the warmth of his hands still resting on her arms. "What feelings would those be, Isaiah?" she asked, though she thought she already knew and needed to hear him say it plainly. "I have come to love you," he said simply, the words falling into the quiet morning like stones into still water. "I have tried to tell myself it was only respect or gratitude for the chance you gave me when I had nothing, but it has grown into something far larger than that, and I did not want to speak it while there was any doubt in your own heart. But watching those men fire on you tonight, I found I could not keep silent any longer." Elvira felt tears rising unexpectedly, tears born not of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. "I have loved you for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself," she said. "I told myself it was foolish, that it was too soon after Thomas, that you were my employee and it would be improper. But I have watched you save this ranch, Isaiah, watched you work yourself to exhaustion for a place that was not even your own, and I do not think I can keep pretending any longer that it is only gratitude I feel." Isaiah's hand rose slowly to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "Then perhaps we might stop pretending, both of us, and see where honesty leads us." "Perhaps we might," she whispered, and when he leaned down and kissed her, gently, as though she were something precious he feared might break, she felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 2 long years finally begin to loosen. They rode back to the ranch that morning with the recovered cattle bawling ahead of them, and though nothing was announced to Danny or Pete, something in the easy silence between Elvira and Isaiah, the way their horses walked close together, the occasional glance exchanged between them, told a story that the two young hands were far too wise to comment on, though Danny grinned rather more than usual over breakfast that day. The romance that grew between them through that autumn was not without its complications. Elvira worried, in quiet moments, about what the valley would say. A widow taking up with her own hired foreman scarcely more than a year and a half after her husband's death. She worried too about the difference in their stations, though Isaiah never once made her feel that her greater wealth, modest as it now was, created any distance between them. "I do not care what the valley says," she told him one evening in October, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set behind the ridge, a habit they had fallen into most evenings once the day's work was done. "I have spent 2 years caring what the valley thought of a widow trying to run her own ranch, and I find I am tired of it." "The valley will say what it says regardless," Isaiah agreed. "I only want to be certain, Elvira, that when we do announce our intentions it is because you are ready and not because you feel pressed by anyone's opinion, mine included." "You are a patient man," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder in the gathering dusk. "More patient than I deserve, I think, given how long I made you wait even for a kind word." "I would have waited a great deal longer," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You were worth waiting for, Elvira Hawkins. You are worth waiting for still." It was in November, with the first hard frost silvering the grass each morning and the herd fat and healthy from the summer's careful management, that Cornelius Blackwood made his final attempt to claim the Hawkins ranch, and it was an attempt far more serious than any offer of purchase. Elvira received a letter from the bank in Larkspur informing her that her note, which she had believed secure through the following spring, had somehow been called due within 30 days, an acceleration the bank claimed was standard practice given what they termed irregularities in her account, though Elvira had kept meticulous records and knew of no such irregularities. She rode into town at once, Isaiah beside her, to confront the bank manager, a nervous man named Silas Corwin who would not quite meet her eyes. "Mr. Corwin, I have paid every installment on time these 2 years past, often at great sacrifice. I demand to know the nature of these supposed irregularities." Corwin shuffled papers on his desk, glancing toward the door as though hoping for rescue. "The matter is somewhat complicated, Mrs. Hawkins. There have been questions raised about the original terms of the loan, questions raised by a party with considerable interest in the bank's continued operations here in Larkspur." "Blackwood," Isaiah said flatly. "He has bought influence over your bank, hasn't he, Corwin? Bought it or bullied it, one or the other." Corwin's silence was answer enough. Elvira felt a cold fury rising in her chest, fiercer than any fear. "Mr. Corwin, you will tell Mr. Blackwood that I will find the funds to satisfy this note within 30 days, every dollar of it, and that he may take his interference and his bullying elsewhere. This ranch is not for sale, and it will not be surrendered through the back door of a corrupt bank either." They rode home in tense silence, the full weight of the situation settling over them both. 30 days was not a great deal of time to raise the sum required, and while the ranch's fortunes had improved considerably under Isaiah's management, they had not improved so dramatically that Elvira had the full amount simply sitting in reserve. "We will sell part of the herd," Isaiah said finally, as they crested the last hill before the ranch house came into view. "Not the breeding stock. We cannot afford to lose that, but the young steers we have been fattening for spring market. It will not fetch as much as waiting until spring wood, selling this early, but it may be enough combined with what you have already saved. And if it is not enough, then we will find another way," Isaiah said firmly. "I did not spend this whole year helping you rebuild this ranch only to watch Cornelius Blackwood steal it through paperwork and bribery. We will find a way, Elvira. I promise you that." The following weeks were a blur of frantic activity. Isaiah rode to neighboring ranches, calling in what few favors and connections he had built over the year, arranging for the sale of the fattened steers at the best price the season would allow. Elvira went through her account books again and again, scraping together every dollar that could possibly be spared, selling a set of silver that had belonged to her mother, selling extra eggs and butter at the market in Larkspur with a diligence that left her exhausted each evening. It was Danny, of all people, who provided an unexpected solution. The young hand had grown close to Isaiah over the year, looking up to him almost as an older brother, and when he learned of the trouble, he rode to his own family's small farm several miles distant and returned 2 days later with his father, a quiet, weathered man named Joseph Whitcomb, and a proposition. "My family has some savings put by, Mrs. Hawkins," Joseph said, standing awkwardly in Elvira's parlor with his hat in his hands. "Not a fortune, but enough to help if you would consider it. Danny has told us how Mr. Yates here turned this ranch around, and how fair you have both been to our boy. We would rather see that money help a decent operation than sit gathering dust in a jar under my floorboards." Elvira was moved nearly to tears by the offer, though she hesitated to accept charity from a family with so little themselves. But Joseph insisted, framing it not as charity but as an investment, an arrangement whereby the Whitcombs would receive a small percentage of interest once the ranch's fortunes were fully secured, an arrangement that satisfied both Elvira's pride and the Whitcombs' practical needs. Combined with the proceeds from the cattle sale and Elvira's own careful savings, the sum was, in the end, just barely sufficient. Elvira rode into Larkspur on the 29th day, 1 day before the deadline, and laid the full amount on Silas Corwin's desk in cash and bank drafts, watching with grim satisfaction as the nervous man counted it out with trembling hands, forced to acknowledge that the note was satisfied in full. "You may tell Mr. Blackwood," Elvira said, rising from her chair, "that the Hawkins ranch remains exactly where it has always been, and exactly to whom it has always belonged. And you may tell him also that if he attempts such interference again, I will take the matter to the Territorial Banking Commission and let them examine his considerable interest in your institution's operations, Mr. Corwin, in rather more detail than I suspect either of you would care for." She left the bank with her head high, and found Isaiah waiting outside with the wagon, his face breaking into a wide smile the moment he saw the look of triumph on her face. "It is done," she said, and he swept her up into his arms right there on the main street of Larkspur, heedless of who might see, spinning her once before setting her back down, both of them laughing with the release of weeks of accumulated tension. "I never doubted you for a moment," he said, though the relief in his voice suggested otherwise, and Elvira laughed and swatted his arm. "You doubted plenty, Isaiah Yates, same as I did. But we did it anyway together." "Together," he agreed, and kissed her right there in the street, and if a few passers-by raised their eyebrows at a widow kissing her foreman in broad daylight, neither of them cared one bit. Cornelius Blackwood made no further attempts after that. Whether it was the threat of the Territorial Banking Commission, or simply the recognition that the Hawkins Ranch, under Isaiah's management, had grown too strong and too well regarded in the valley to be easily bullied any further. He retreated from his campaign entirely, and in time even offered a grudging nod of respect when their paths crossed at the county cattle auction the following spring, though the warmth between the two operations never extended much beyond civility. Winter settled over the valley with its usual harsh beauty, snow drifting deep against the fence lines. The cattle huddled in the sheltered draws where Isaiah had thoughtfully positioned extra hay stores before the first storms arrived. It was during this quiet season, with the ranch secure and the immediate threats behind them, that Isaiah asked Elvira to marry him. He did not do it with any great ceremony, which suited them both, having never been people much given to grand gestures. It happened on a clear, cold evening in January, the stars unusually bright and close in the black sky, as they stood together at the corral fence checking on a mare close to foaling. "Elvira," Isaiah said, his breath clouding in the frigid air, "I have been thinking that I do not wish to be your foreman any longer." Elvira turned to him, startled and a little hurt, wondering if somehow, after everything, he meant to leave. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, taking her gloved hands in his, "that I do not wish to spend the rest of my life being paid a wage to love this land and to love you, when I could instead simply be your husband, and love you and this ranch as my own, because they already are my own, in every way that matters except in the eyes of the law and the church." Relief and joy flooded through her so quickly she nearly laughed aloud. "Isaiah Yates, are you asking me to marry you in the middle of checking on a pregnant mare? I am asking you to marry me under the finest stars I believe I have ever seen, in the company of a mare who does not mind at all, and who I think would be glad to see us settled before her foal arrives," he said, and there was such warmth and humor in his voice, mixed with an underlying tremor of genuine nervousness, that Elvira's heart nearly overflowed. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Isaiah, I will marry you. I have wanted to say yes since long before you asked, if I am honest." He kissed her then, there in the cold January dark, the mare shifting quietly in her stall nearby, and Elvira thought that she had never in her life felt so completely certain of anything as she felt certain of this. They were married in April, once the worst of the winter had passed, and the first green shoots of new grass had begun pushing up through the softened earth. The ceremony was held in the small church in Larkspur, modest but full, for by that time nearly everyone in the valley had heard the story of how the widow Hawkins and her foreman had saved a failing ranch, and in the process found each other. Danny stood as one witness, grinning through the entire ceremony, and Joseph Whitcomb's wife had helped Elvira sew her wedding dress from a bolt of pale blue cloth that Elvira had been saving for years without quite knowing what she was saving it for. The Reverend, an elderly man named Amos Prout, who had presided over Elvira's first wedding to Thomas 8 years before, spoke with particular warmth of second chances and of love found in unexpected seasons of life. "Marriage," he said, looking between them with a kindly smile, "is not merely the joining of two hearts, but the joining of two burdens, so that what once felt impossibly heavy for one person to carry becomes, shared between two, something that can be carried with grace, even with joy. I have watched this valley these past 2 years, and I have watched what these two people have built together, out of grief and hardship and hard, honest labor. I do not think I have ever married two people better suited to carry each other's burdens, nor two people more deserving of the joy I believe now awaits them." When Isaiah kissed his bride at the end of the ceremony, the small church erupted in applause and a few enthusiastic whoops from Danny and Pete, and Elvira laughed through happy tears, thinking that she had never imagined, on that rainy evening when a stranger stood in her barn doorway with a broken plow in his hands, that he would become the whole center of her world. The years that followed were not without their ordinary hardships, the sort every rancher faces: a dry summer here, a hard winter there, the occasional sickness moving through the herd that had to be managed with careful doctoring, and long, worried nights in the barn. But the foundation Isaiah had built in that first difficult year held strong, and the ranch continued to prosper under their joint management, until by 1882, the Hawkins Ranch, now known throughout the valley as the Hawkins Yates spread, though Elvira had kept her first husband's name attached out of respect for his memory, and Isaiah had never once objected, had become widely regarded as one of the finest operations for 50 miles in any direction. They expanded the herd gradually and carefully, always favoring quality over quantity, just as Isaiah had insisted from that very first conversation about the red Hereford bull. They dug additional wells, expanded the irrigation ditches, built a new barn with a proper hayloft that could store enough feed to see the herd through even the harshest winters. Danny, now grown into a capable young man of 20, stayed on as a permanent hand and eventually as assistant foreman, while Pete married a young woman from Larkspur and settled into a small parcel of land Isaiah, and Elvira sold him at generous terms once he had saved enough to start his own modest operation. The envy of the valley, folks began calling the Hawkins Yates Ranch, not with bitterness but with genuine admiration, for everyone who had watched the transformation understood the story behind it, understood how much labor and love and stubborn refusal to give up had gone into building something so fine out of what had once been a failing, struggling operation on the verge of collapse. In the autumn of 1879, less than a year after their wedding, Elvira discovered she was carrying a child, news that filled the ranch house with a joy so profound that even the hardened old ranch hands found themselves smiling for days after Isaiah, unable to contain himself, announced it at the supper table with tears openly in his eyes. "A son or a daughter, it makes no difference to me," Isaiah told Elvira one evening as they sat together on the porch, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, his hand covering hers. "I only pray for a healthy child and for you to come through it safely, Elvira. That is all I could ever ask." "I have a feeling," Elvira said, smiling in the gathering dusk, "that this child, whoever they turn out to be, will have your patience and your steady hands, and I hope my stubbornness, because I think a ranching life requires no small amount of stubbornness to see it through. Then I pity whoever tries to cross this child once they are grown," Isaiah laughed, and pressed a kiss to her temple. Their son, whom they named Samuel Thomas Yates, honoring both Isaiah's late father and Elvira's first husband in a gesture that moved the whole valley when the story became known, was born in the spring of 1880, on a night when a gentle rain fell across the valley, the same sort of rain that had first brought Isaiah to Elvira's barn door 2 years before. Isaiah wept openly when the midwife placed the squalling infant in his arms, and Elvira, exhausted but glowing with a happiness she had never imagined possible in the darkest days of her widowhood, watched her husband cradle their son and thought that her heart might burst from the fullness of it. 2 years later, in 1882, a daughter followed, whom they named Ruth Ann, after Isaiah's mother, and the ranch house that had once echoed with the loneliness of a grieving widow now rang with the laughter of children, the barking of the ranch dogs, the constant good-natured chaos of a family growing and thriving in the place that had once nearly been lost to debt and despair. Elvira often thought, in quiet moments watching her husband teach young Samuel how to sit properly in a saddle, or watching him cradle baby Ruth Ann against his shoulder while reviewing the ranch's accounts by lamplight, that she had been given a gift she had never thought to ask for, a second chance at love in a life she had believed was destined to be lived out in solitary grief. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked him once, several years into their marriage, as they lay together in the quiet dark of their bedroom, the children asleep down the hall. "When you stood in my barn doorway with that broken plow." "I think about it often," Isaiah admitted, his arm tightening around her. "I think about how close I came to simply leaving that plow by the door and riding on, the way I told you I intended to. I had drifted so long by then, Elvira, from one hard job to the next, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, never believing I had any right to want more than survival after everything the war had taken from me. If your milk cow had not been bawling that particular night, if the rain had not driven me to seek shelter in your barn specifically rather than somewhere else along the road, I do not know that our paths would ever have crossed. Then I am grateful to Bessie, Elvira laughed softly, for bawling loud enough to draw a hungry drifter into my barn on exactly the right night. I am grateful for a great many small things that led me here, Isaiah said, turning to press a tender kiss to her forehead. But mostly I am grateful for you, Elvira, for your courage in taking a chance on a stranger with nothing to his name but a sway-backed horse and a broken plow he thought to mend out of simple decency. You gave me back everything the war and the years of drifting had taken from me. You gave me a home and a purpose and a family, and I do not think I could ever fully express how much that has meant to me. You gave me the same, Isaiah, Elvira said softly. I was drowning that first year after Thomas died, drowning in debt and grief and a stubbornness that would not let me ask for the help I so desperately needed. You did not just save this ranch. You saved me too, though I do not think either of us fully understood that at the time. Their family continued to grow in the years that followed. A second son, William, arrived in 1885, followed by another daughter, Margaret, in 1888. Each birth attended by the same joy and gratitude that had marked Samuel and Ruth Ann's arrivals. Each child raised on a ranch that had transformed, under the steady partnership of Elvira Hawkins and Isaiah Yates, from a failing operation on the brink of foreclosure into the most respected and prosperous spread in the entire Sweetwater Valley. By 1890, the Hawkins-Yates Ranch had grown to encompass nearly 4,000 head of prime cattle, along with a breeding program for quarter horses that had begun to draw buyers from as far away as Denver and Cheyenne. Danny Whitcomb, now a married man himself with 2 children of his own, had risen to full partnership in the operation, an arrangement Isaiah had insisted upon as a token of gratitude for the young man's loyalty through the hardest early years. The ranch house itself had been expanded twice, first to accommodate the growing family and later to include a wide porch where Elvira liked to sit in the evenings, watching her children play in the yard while Isaiah finished his final rounds of the day. Cornelius Blackwood, growing older and somewhat mellowed by the passage of years, eventually sold his own interest in the Diamond B to a cattle syndicate out of Chicago and retired to a comfortable house in Cheyenne. And though he and Isaiah never became close, the old animosity between them faded into the kind of distant civility common among longtime neighbors who have simply outlasted their earlier grievances. Reverend Prout, who had married them all those years before, lived long enough to baptize each of their 4 children, and often remarked in his gentle way that he considered the story of Elvira Hawkins and Isaiah Yates among the finest examples of God's providence he had witnessed in his many years serving the small community of Larkspur, a story he was fond of retelling to young couples he counseled before their own weddings, as proof that even the deepest grief and the hardest circumstances could, with patience and courage and honest love, be transformed into something extraordinary. On the evening of their 12th wedding anniversary, in April of 1890, Elvira and Isaiah stood together at the same corral fence where he had first proposed to her all those years before, watching the sun set behind the western ridge in the same wash of orange and violet that had colored so many of their evenings together. Their children's voices carried from the house behind them, Samuel now 10 years old and already showing the makings of a fine young rancher, Ruth Ann 8 and fiercely determined to learn everything her older brother knew, William 5, and trailing after his siblings with the single-minded devotion of a younger child desperate to keep up, and little Margaret, not yet 2, being minded by the housekeeper Elvira had finally been able to afford in recent years. "Do you remember," Elvira said, leaning into her husband's side as the evening chill began to settle over the valley, "how frightened I was that first year, certain that everything Thomas had built was slipping through my fingers no matter how hard I fought to hold on to it. "I remember," Isaiah said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I remember thinking, that first morning I woke up in your bunkhouse, that I had never in my life met a woman so determined to succeed against odds that would have broken most people entirely. I did not succeed alone," she reminded him, as she had reminded him so many times over the years. "I succeeded because a stranger with a broken plow decided a widow's failing ranch was worth staying for. I stayed," Isaiah said quietly, turning to look at her with an expression of such deep tenderness that even after 12 years of marriage it still made her breath catch, "because I fell in love with the most stubborn, most courageous, most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and because I could not imagine my life continuing down any other road once I had found her. And are you glad you stayed?" She asked, though she already knew the answer, had known it for years in every gentle touch, every quiet word of encouragement, every moment of partnership through hardship and joy alike. "I have never been more glad of anything in my entire life," Isaiah said, and he kissed her then, softly, beneath the same wide sky that had witnessed so much of their story together. The failing ranch behind them now transformed into the envy of the valley, the lonely widow and the drifting foreman transformed into a partnership, so complete that neither could any longer imagine where one ended and the other began. Behind them, the ranch house glowed warm with lamplight against the deepening dusk, filled with the sounds of their children's laughter. The barn stood sturdy and well-tended in the yard. The herds grazed contentedly across pastures that had once been choked with weeds and neglect. And the whole valley, as far as the eye could see in the gathering dark, bore witness to what patient love and honest labor could build from even the most unlikely and broken beginnings. They stood together at that fence until the last light faded entirely from the sky, and then, hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, toward their children, toward the life they had built together out of grief and hope and stubborn, unwavering love, a life that had begun with nothing more than a broken plow, a bawling milk cow, and two people brave enough to take a chance on each other when the whole world might have counted them both as lost causes. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and the ranch continued to prosper, as Samuel eventually took over much of the day-to-day management with his father's same steady patience, as Ruth Ann married a fine young rancher from a neighboring valley, and William proved himself a natural horseman just as skilled as his father had been, as little Margaret grew into a woman as strong and determined as her own mother had been all those years before, Elvira and Isaiah remained exactly what they had always been to each other since that very first honest conversation in the muddy barnyard. Partners in every sense of the word, bound not merely by the legal ties of marriage, but by a deep and abiding love that had been tested by hardship and had only grown stronger for the testing. A love that had transformed not only a failing ranch, but two grieving, weary souls into something whole, something joyful, something that the entire Sweetwater Valley would speak of for years to come as one of the finest love stories the territory had ever known. They grew old together on that land, watching seasons turn and grandchildren arrive in their own time, and never once, in all the decades that followed, did either of them regret the rainy spring evening when a stranger's broken plow had led, however improbably, to a lifetime of shared purpose and deepening love.